Welcome, everyone, to this webinar on civic education in a time of democratic crisis. My name is David Campbell, and I will be filling in for William Galston, who was unable to make it as our moderator today, but I will do my very best to channel Bill Galston, whom I have known for a long time, although I do not claim to have his depth of expertise in this topic, but I hope you can bear with us. I'm going to take a moment and introduce our panel and then talk a little bit about what we hope to accomplish during our webinar today. And I'll be sure to highlight the volume of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. You can see this on the screen right now. I'll talk a little bit more about that volume in just a few minutes. But let me begin by introducing each of our panelists, all of whom come to us with considerable experience and expertise and a deep knowledge of the important topic of civic education. I will begin with Paul Carisse, who is the founding director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. And Paul has been quite active in the field of civic education, and we look forward to hearing his comments today. I will move next to Linda Darling-Hammond, who is the president and CEO of the Learning Policy Institute. She's also an emeritus professor of education at Stanford and serves as president of the California State Board of Education. I'm not sure how she has time to participate in webinars like this, but we're grateful for her. And I should note that both Paul and Linda are participating from time zones far in the West. So it is early in the morning for both of them, and we're grateful that they got up early. In fact, I believe the sun is rising as we are speaking. Is that correct, Linda, where you are?
It is.
Next, we have Peter Levine, who is the Lincoln Filene Professor at Tufts University in their Tisch College of Civic Life. Peter, of course, has done many things in the world of civic ed, but I will put a plug in for his most recent book, What Should We Do? A Theory of Civic Life. I'll move next to Kent McGuire, who is the Program Director of Education at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which, of course, has been an important source of funding and a voice, and just very active in the field of civic education. He's done a variety of things in philanthropy and academia, but worth noting that he was the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education from 1998 to 2001, and so comes to us with that background as well. And last but not least, we have Naila Suad-Nasir, who is the president of the Spencer Foundation, although she also has a background in academia with appointments in education and African American studies at Berkeley. And she served as a vice chancellor there as well for equity and inclusion. There's, of course, much more I could say about each one of our panelists, and I hope they will forgive me for not going over all of their many accomplishments, but I can assure all of those who have assembled for our webinar that these are folks who know what they're talking about. Now, what are we talking about? Well, let me address just for a moment what has brought us together here, which is this special issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. The title of the volume is Civic Education in a Time of Democratic Crisis. And just by way of background, you should know that this volume actually began with a report from the National Academy of Education on the topic of educating for civic reasoning and discourse. And that gives me an opportunity to acknowledge the tremendous work of Carol Lee, who I don't believe is with us today, but also Greg White and Diane Dong from the National Academy of Education, who have been, they are co-editors in the volume, but more than instrumental in pulling this all together. And so I'm grateful for their work as well. You should all know that the volume on which this is based is available to the world for free for roughly the next month or so. It's a limited time offer, but if you're interested in learning more, digging deeper, You can consult the volume. You can find it online. We encourage you to read it, to engage with it, to cite it, to assign it. We want this to be really an opportunity for people to dig deep into what many of the leading scholars across different disciplines have to say about civic education at this polarized time. And I do want to emphasize that the whole idea behind the volume is that it actually spans multiple disciplines. So people from education schools and political science and sociology and just a variety of disciplines, each of which have, I think, an important contribution to make to civic education. With all of that out of the way, I think we should move to talking about civic education. So the way this will work is I will pose some questions to get us started to our panelists. We'll continue with that discussion for a while, for roughly 50 or so minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A from the assembled audience. Now, this being a webinar, not a conventional Zoom session, means that we, as the panelists, cannot see those of you who are participating. So it's a little bit like, I suppose, being on a radio show. But you do have an opportunity to pose questions to us through the question and answer box. Those will be moderated. So they will be fed to me, and then I will pose them to the panelists, and there will probably be points at which we will combine questions or try to synthesize what people are thinking and saying. So just keep that in mind when we turn to the Q&A session. You will pose your questions again through the question and answer box provided there on your Zoom interface. I'm just looking here. We've had the link sent to us as the panelists. If I could ask maybe one of the panelists to figure out a way if we can send the link to the volume to everyone listening to the webinar, that would be great. All right, so as we get started, let me just remind everybody who might have joined us a little late that I am not Bill Galston. I am instead Dave Campbell, and I'll be serving as the moderator. Just a little bit about me. I'm a professor at the University of Notre Dame, and I've written a little bit about civic education and democracy and social capital and such things over the course of my career. But my job is primarily here to serve as the moderator, but I may interject some of my own thoughts along the way. I may not be able to resist. But let's start. I'm going to start with a question about renewed civic education. We're at a very interesting point, I think, for those of us who care about civic ed. Seems to me there's a lot of attention being paid to this topic across the political spectrum, from policymakers, from educators, from the general public. And so I'm interested in hearing from our panelists what they think this renewed civic education might look like, and how do we renew civic education at the same time that we have a very polarized and contentious political environment. So how do we do that? How do we renew civic education and come up with a curriculum that could be widely accepted across the country? Not an easy question, but one worth grappling with. So let me just throw that to our panelists and ask if anyone has some thoughts on how we do this.
David, I'll jump in. First of all, thanks to all the institutions and all the leaders organizing this. And we're delighted to have so many people participating. It's a paradox with any policy issue that often a crisis moment is needed before there's sufficient attention and energy to come up with plausible remedies. And also, I would say at this moment, to suggest to certain people that compromises across the range of views about what civics is, what civic education is, might be very necessary at this moment. So Peter Levine and I were co-authors of a national study that was released in 2021 called Educating for American Democracy, and I'll drop a link to that into the chat. It was a federally funded study, but very much adopted the principle of federalism, that for a study of K-12 civics and history education, what the landscape was and how we might improve the landscape. We decided not to propose something like a national curriculum, but rather broad guidelines that states and local education authorities could use on the premise of a recognition that we could do better in all states and localities with civic education and history education K-12. And one of the principles we adopted, in addition to federalism, was the idea of compromise across the expert views of what an American civics education should be for school students, what should an American history education be for school students, for citizens or aspiring citizens, to prepare them to be self-governing citizens as full adults. And among the compromises was to understand that everything about civics and history education in K-12 is polarized, just like so much of our politics is polarized, to confront that. And in the design of the lead team, we had a kind of principle of pluralism in mind. So I am a constitutional intellectual conservative as an academic, and I was deliberately invited into the lead author team. We had a veteran school teacher turned state level policy leader on civics and history education as one of the lead authors. So a range of ways that we brought well over 300 people into that study in the different lead task forces and feedback sounding board groups, from higher education to museum and other kinds of civic educators to obviously K-12 educators and policymakers. So the paradox of recognizing a crisis, and we are in a civic crisis in America, we are in a civic education crisis, but a crisis motivating some people to recognize that pluralism and compromise and deliberation is the appropriate approach to come up with a remedy, rather than just a perpetuation of the polarization and the crisis.
Thank you, Paul. Just a quick follow-up. I know there'll be others who want to weigh in on this, but did you find, as you worked on educating for American democracy, that you were able to find compromises that worked for people who, maybe had ideological differences, or they may have had other differences too, pedagogical differences, or just sort of different ways they might think about civic education?
Yes, it's in the essence of a civic education, we thought, to prepare citizens, aspiring citizens, for disagreement. So Peter Levine and I have known each other a long time. We know we disagree on some fundamental issues. I'm sure he's wrong, and he's, but I do my best with him. But this is exactly what students in learning about American history and about American civics need to grapple with. Their fundamental core knowledge, ideas, and then as grade levels increase toward high school, you explicitly address with students the disagreements about an important historical moment, an important civic principle. That's part of what they need to learn about being a free human being and being a citizen in our complex constitutional democratic republic. And Peter can talk about more, other compromises we came up with.
Thank you. Other thoughts, Peter? Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, it was a pleasure to serve with Paul. Great to be with the rest of the panel, and wonderful to see many friends as well as others on the call. Yeah, I think it's worth talking about renewal a little bit, I guess, precisely, because sometimes people think that they come into this conversation thinking, there's terrible deficits with our civil society, and it must be partly because we don't teach civics anymore. And I took civics when I was a kid, and why don't we teach civics anymore? And that kind of discussion goes off the rails after a little while, because you discover that actually every state has social studies standards K-12. Most students are taking civics, especially if you include American history as part of it, and that is one of the main ways that we learn civics. There are many, many talented and dedicated teachers in America teaching civics. And so after, and in fact, for example, the civics, both the policy and the curriculum that I got in New York State schools in the early 1980s was terrible. So so it just goes off the rails if you think that the problem is there's something we've all forgotten about civics. There are, though, significant challenges that are kind of critical and that require renewal. I think some of them are on the side of the Republic, that we do have problems like polarization and marginalization and disenfranchisement and maybe even rising violence and also complexity and social media and other things that require a new look. And then civics, even though it has been taught all along, and there have been great teachers and there have been great curricula, it has also been a bit of a backwater. So, for example, there's been very little governmental investment or even philanthropic investment, apart from Spencer, thank you, in things like the development of better pedagogy or curricula. And then the current moment is one of much greater attention to civics, actually. So those of us who've been in this business for a long time always used to struggle to get anyone to pay any attention at all. And now there's a lot of attention. I think we're going to talk about policy later, and I'll defer on that to my colleagues. But lots of policy change, but it is polarized. So people have reform proposals that are, directly contradictory to each other, and states are adopting policies that are directly contradictory. So I think we discovered through the Educating for American Democracy project was that actually reasonable people with quite distinct ideologies, Paul's are incorrect, but and mine are correct, but they were distinct, can actually, I'm just kidding, obviously, can actually reach consensus, and not even that with that great a difficulty. And the other things I would quickly just say is we were trying to, we weren't only trying to affect standards. We had a broader theory of change, but one kind of good mental exercise is to think, well, what should standards look like? And because standards are part of the landscape. And in thinking about standards, I think we were pushing for greater coherence than a typical standards document, which can be hundreds of pages of fairly miscellaneous concepts. And that standards there are a symbol for what students experience, which is often a fairly miscellaneous set of ideas that are just thrown at them for unclear reasons. So we were trying to come up with many fewer big, challenging K-12 topics, so that it takes 13 years to talk about these things. They're lifelong questions, and marrying or carefully combining both history and civics, which is heavily political science and philosophy and some related topics. And I think we succeeded, but I also think one of the things we were trying to do was stimulate more reflection and deliberation. So it's a contribution to a national deliberation. And you could, and this is my last thought, is you could almost say one of the things we need renewal of is a kind of good public debate about what our students should learn. That it's not to be lamented that people disagree, or even that it's a pretty hot topic, because it's very high stakes. And we're a diverse country, and it would be unnatural if people all just automatically agreed. But we need a better conversation. So we were trying to model the conversation. And that means that if you were to read Educating for American Democracy and you think it's off, then that's perfectly fine. What we would be hoping for would be that then you would weigh in with your thoughts and we can continue the conversation. Thanks.
I think
Please go ahead, Linda.
if I could just add on to what you learn about, which is often how civics was thought about, like you learn about the functions of American government and the separation of powers in the judicial system and all of the things that are important in that regard. There's foundational knowledge and skills, but what do we want students to participate in? What do we want them to be able to do? What kind of engagement? In California, tackled this, we require a civics course, but there's also throughout every grade level in science and social studies curriculum framework, 4 things that are identified as goals of civic education that are infused with, lessons and strategies. One is the foundational knowledge. One is the cognitive skills to be able to deliberate and problem solve and reach consensus and, engage in that kind of analytic conversation. A third one is participation. What should students participate in? And there's a lot of attention to participatory skills of listening and speaking and working together and analyzing different points of view and taking multiple perspectives and engaging in civil discourse. And then the fourth one is dispositions. What does one feel compelled to do, so to speak? What does one feel one's civic obligation is, and how do you engage in it? And I think one of the things that we talked about in the chapter that Kent and I worked on policy is that the nature of the school itself and the school experience itself really matters. So when I was teaching high school in big factory model warehouse, urban high schools, kids moved from one class to another. There were a whole bunch of rules that could get you kicked out or, punished in some way. The rules came from on high somewhere. They were in a handbook. It was all about what you could get punished for, and there's just long lists of things. You go from teacher to teacher. Nobody knew most of the kids very well because they saw 180 kids a day, 6 periods, 30 at a time. Then you had a transmission curriculum that you're supposed to deliver. So that's kind of the assumption of that old factory model. I had the privilege of then working with people, especially in New York City, who were creating new schools. There was an era in the 90s of creating very small democratic schools where students are involved in setting the norms for their school and the classroom, and teachers are involved in the decision making, and deliberation and debate goes on in civil and consensual ways. There's a real explicit attention to community building and what responsibilities you have for others in your community, the teaching of sort of social and emotional skills and capacities that allow you to be a member of a community, and then engaging in community connected projects and so on. So that experience creates a civic minded approach for students that allows them to understand deeply what it means to be a member of a civic process. And I think that's also important as we think about the ways in which we're defining all the things that we need to get to the goals that we have in the country.
Thank you, Linda. Let me just ask a question and encourage all panelists to weigh in on this if you'd like. We don't want to paint a Pollyanna-ish vision of where we are with civic education. There are still unresolved questions. There are certainly fault lines. There are, arguments to be had about what civic education should look like. And one of the tensions that I see is painting now with a very broad brush between those who focus on knowledge, which is presumably the motivation behind many states adopting the citizenship test as a graduation requirement, right? So there's an emphasis on what people know. And then there are others who want to put more emphasis on what people do, or, encouraging participation in the public square. Obviously, those two things do not exist in separate universes. There's some, symbiosis there between those two. But my sense is that those are two areas of emphasis. At least when I teach about civic education to my students, I point out that there are these sort of different areas of emphasis. And I'm curious in hearing from the panelists of where they feel there might be consensus on that, or is it really just a matter that we're still at a point of disagreement on what we should be emphasizing in civic education? So what is the balance between what you know and learning what you need to do?
Yeah, this feels like one of those both and type questions to me. Like, yes, absolutely. Young people and adults need to have a certain body of knowledge to understand our system of government, the various modes of civic participation, the content of the debates that are happening in the public square. And there needs to be an orientation and a set of dispositions towards engagement, participation, how we talk to one another across difference, right? I don't know if there's as much a shortage of content knowledge right now as a paucity of productive ways of engaging across lines of difference. And I think that's particularly important given that we are in this kind of democratic experiment, but also in a democratic experiment in a context that is increasingly diverse with respect to the range of communities that are participating and the increasing diversity of our nation. And so as that happens, how we learn to engage across the places where we don't agree feels just critically important to me.
So how do we do that? How do we allow for students to engage with one another so they learn what it means to be a participant in a civic republic, at a time when many states are making it very clear to teachers that there are issues that are off limits, and even if there's not an actual piece of legislation, we know this from both anecdotes and survey data that many teachers just feel the pressure. They just don't want to bring this up. They don't want to touch it. How do we manage that? How can it be that on the one hand, we know if students are actually engaging in real issues, they learn more, and at the same time, we have a political environment that makes it very difficult for teachers to encourage that kind of discussion and dialogue in the classroom?
I mean, this is a challenging question, so there's not a slam dunk easy answer. I think part of it is some affirmative statements by prominent people and also by bipartisan groups that say that addressing controversial issues in school is actually something that we want, because we want to teach civility and civic friendship, which is a term that we use. And you can't really do that if you marginalize anything that people disagree about. And freedom of speech too is a value. And what one of the ways that this plays out is that when a conversation in a school goes badly, at least by some people's lives, but sometimes it just really does go badly, that makes news and that becomes a controversy. And the takeaway is that maybe we shouldn't have schools dealing with these issues at all. And very few people ever say, but we want students to talk about hard issues. Then in order to have that go well, there has to be good professional development, because it's actually very challenging to moderate a discussion of a controversial issue with children or adults, or children or adults, yes, but also adolescents. You can learn about that. And we also need school, district, and state policies that are supportive. Dave, I also wanted to sort of say something quickly about your original question, which is about sort of what are the lines of disagreement within the civics field. And you posed a kind of action versus understanding or knowledge. I think that's real. I think there's a kind of continuum between people who are very enthusiastic about experiential learning and getting your hands doing the work, and people who believe in sort of theory and academic study and books and articles and things like that. That doesn't map onto right or left. It really doesn't. That crosses, I believe that just is completely orthogonal to the right or left distinction. Because, for example, if critical race study theory was really taught in schools, which it pretty much isn't, but if it was taught, it would be theory. It's called critical race theory for a reason. It would be reading Du Bois and Kimberly Crenshaw, and it would be books and articles in the past. And then on the other hand, there's a kind of let's serve in our local community to understand how local community works. That's very conservative, if at least little c conservative. It's very so that's a distinction though between more academic and more experiential. I mean, with NAEP, I would like to say both, but especially over a K-12 curriculum, you have a lot of time. Another distinction that's underneath things, I think, is sort of how pro system versus how critical people are. That also doesn't exactly map onto right or left, because you have people on both right and left who are anti-system. Perhaps the place where people are most pro-system is in the middle, in the center. But anyway, reasonable people can disagree on how pro or anti-system they are, but that's percolating underneath. And so I think we sort of have to, that's the kind of thing you have to deliberate about if you're actually trying to figure out a policy or a curriculum or a textbook or anything that is an intervention here in this area.
But I'd love to put in a word for disciplined inquiry. Sometimes there's sort of this notion that you're off doing something experiential and otherwise you're studying things, but there's a habit of mind that you want to develop in young people that has roots in how they can listen and read and look at and analyze evidence and think about what the evidence suggests, and then hear other evidence from others and then analyze the ways in which those agree or disagree. The schools now that are beginning to do conflict resolution and cooperative learning training across the school in every subject area are helping students learn how to listen, to each other, learn how to bring evidence to bear. Modes of operation that can help people get to consensus are actually a discipline of their own that enable people to think things that, hear each other speak, think about what each other have said. I appreciated the little exchange between Paul and Peter about who's right and who's wrong, but I'm quite sure that in the course of the discussions that you've had, there has been some attention to the points of view and some consensus building. And learning to do that is a skill in itself that should be developed in every content area and every part of the school and in every part of the experience. And so I think the problem with either just a transmission approach or an inquiry approach is that it doesn't always take into account the habit of mind and the skills that are needed for productive, discourse and consensus building and so on.
Let me take Linda's comment and turn it into a list. Maybe be easier for folks to follow. So I'd start by saying that our schools need to impart the knowledge, skills, and dispositions for effective democratic and community engagement. I mean, I think this mindset is a big part of that. I think our schools I don't think it would hurt if they could do a better job of conveying common facts and information. One of the things young people, we haven't figured out how to do is to help them discern fact from fiction. So learning how to grapple, with information would be enormously helpful. And maybe this might be the hardest, the one where teachers, Peter, need the most help. But if our schools could give students new frames for thinking about societal problems, a better toolbox for grappling with what's going on in the world, that too, I think, would help enormously. What isn't helpful is this efforts to kind of restrict what students can read and what teachers can do. I appreciate some of the motivation for where that comes from, but that actually, I think, is counterproductive. I do think knowledge of how a constitutional republic works goes hand in hand with grappling with problems, in the democracy. So the irony here is that, we actually do need kids to know a lot more foundational knowledge about how the government works, because they'll be much better prepared to actually think and behave democratically if they do.
Thank you. I know that there are questions coming in, and we'll be sure to get to those, but there were a couple of themes I wanted to make sure we hit with the panelists as well. I'm going to pivot a little bit to an important theme in the volume that has come up implicitly so far, but let's make it explicit, and that is, what can the literature on learning science, and whoever takes this question, maybe take a moment and just define for the audience what learning science or learning sciences consists of. But what do we know about that body of research that can inform effective civic education? That is, how can we take what we know about what people learn and translate that into the civic space, which, is a subject to be taught in the way that others are. So it's not like it's sitting off on its own island. Naila, do you want to take that? Maybe.
Yeah, happy to jump in. I contributed a chapter with my colleagues Carol Lee and Mary Helen Imordino Yang. Carol Lee's a learning scientist, Mary Helen is a neuroscientist. And so in that piece, we kind of delve into the what is it that we know from the learning sciences, which is really the study of how people learn? What is it that we know from the learning sciences that might be useful to the set of questions that we're kind of collectively grappling with around civic education, and in particular kind of civic reasoning and civic discourse? And, we point out first that there are some things we know that we didn't know 30 years ago, right? We know that learning isn't just a cognitive act, that it is a social act, that it is a cultural act, that it has to do with identity and emotion. And we know that not just from the studies of learning where we can kind of see learners engage and understand what they learn. We know it from the neurological evidence on how we are hardwired as humans. Well, that means a lot of things for this context, right? It means that if identity and emotion are critical to learning, these topics around that we take up under the umbrella of civic engagement actually are quite emotional and touch at the heart of people's identity. Well, that's very rich fodder to create great learning spaces. We know that the seeds of civic reasoning and learning happen very early in development. Moral development and moral reasoning develops in very young children, as does the capacity for empathy. So in many ways, we are hardwired for this kind of thinking and learning. We make the argument in the paper that there are several kinds of dispositions that you could use to kind of frame what we're after here, that lean into what we know from the learning sciences and what we think we want and know that young people need to know how to do. Valuing of complexity and weighing different points of view is really critical to this kind of engagement. That's one. Two, making ethical commitments to empathize with others, really centering empathy in our conversations, and then valuing and doing good for others. So this combination of kind of empathy, being a part of a community, and complex reasoning, we argue are really at the heart of what you want to prepare young people to be able to do. And there are many, many ways in the context of the curriculum to do that. We take the stance that this should happen across content areas, across the developmental span, and that there are ways to do that in classrooms from very early children all the way up through adolescents and even college students.
Thank you.
Could I
Go
follow
ahead,
up?
Paul. Yep.
Yes, could I follow up on those very helpful comments and wrap in some earlier questions you posed and some comments from the panel. In the Educating for American Democracy report, we decided to talk about civic knowledge and civic virtues, as well as civic participation, civic engagement. So this middle term comes in, and it's the old-fashioned term specific to civics that addresses the learning and pedagogy sets of more specific social scientific knowledge that is also a part of the report. There's a separate pedagogy appendix to the Educating for American Democracy report. But civic virtues used to be a natural term about self-governing peoples, democratic republics, that virtues are needed of the citizens and expectations for the leaders. So one element of our democratic crisis right now is the angry polarization and also loss of confidence in almost all major institutions and all major professions. And one wonders if a part of that loss of confidence is because so many people are disgusted with what politics is or has become now, with anger. So the virtues, the old-fashioned word virtues, the educational pedagogy language is about dispositions and skills and such, but that term virtues can paradoxically be a grounding and a unifying set of ideas in civics education and even history education. If you put in front of teachers and teacher preparation, and then in front of students, school board, others, this idea that this is hard, being a free citizen, self-governing, participating, being an aspiring citizen, this is hard work. These are important multiple disciplines involved, and the knowledge, as well as the dispositions and attitudes, as well as preparation for engagement. This is hard work. So among the virtues that we've identified were patriotism in the American way, reflective patriotism, a term that Alexis de Tocqueville uses in Democracy in America when he visits us in the 1830s. The Americans have a kind of argumentative, rational patriotism. They love America, they believe in America, they're proud of being American, but they want to argue about everything. Just what does America mean? Is the government doing what it should be doing? Is the government, protecting our rights the way it should? So a reflective patriotism as a civic virtue, civil disagreement as a civic virtue. Free people, Tocqueville says, are going to disagree about everything all the time, right? While also having in common that they are Americans. That's the patriotism part. We're in this together, e pluribus unum. So reflective patriotism, civil disagreement, and civic friendship. So I'm the conservative. I'm introducing these old-fashioned terms. Civic friendship. Peter and I disagree about really important things. I respect that he's smart. I think he respects that I'm smart. We respect that we disagree. But we're Americans and we're fellow professionals and we live to talk another day about these things. And eventually I'll persuade Peter that I'm right. But the civic culture of understanding that people of a different partisan or philosophical view are not evil, you disagree with them, you think they're wrong. And it's important and it's serious, but we're in this together. So that's and just one final point, that set of language, those ideas, civic virtues can be motivating for students to think I'm an American. We're all Americans. There are people here who are immigrants who are aspiring Americans. We're all in this together. This can provide a kind of positive culture in schools, which is a whole set of issues about public schools, a positive culture in schools. We are in this together. It's hard work. This is exciting. This is interesting. I have another dimension of life to look forward to.
Yeah. As you're talking, Paul, I was thinking about marrying the way in which one state marries the civic virtues with the civic reasoning. So in Washington State, they have a set of performance tasks that are required of districts to deliver, but they're not used in accountability. One of them for civics is that students have to identify an issue about which there's disagreement and in which there is a tension between the good of the whole and individual freedom. And then they have to research law cases and legislation and sort of legal history around that issue, and then kind of come to a reasoned discussion of how one can balance, the e pluribus unum elements of the good of the whole and the individual freedoms, and they have to think that through. And so that's something that everybody engages in, and there are years of work leading up to both that understanding of the civic virtue and of the process of civic reasoning. I think if we could do more of that rather than just asking people to fill in the multiple choice civics test, we might get the kind of understanding that you're talking about there.
But I agree with that. I also think that there's another element to, you were talking, Paul, about reflective patriotism, and I'm wrestling with that. On the one hand, I think an important part of patriotism is that identity as American and the collective and what we all hold. And I think that part of what's happening in the public discourse is the recognition that while that has been true in the ideal, in the practice, it hasn't always been true. And part of patriotic engagement is holding us collectively to a higher standard about how we offer enfranchisement across the board more fully. And so I think that if that definition of patriotism includes pushing us all to be better, pushing our country to be better, I think that's just a really important dimension of that. And it feels quite virtuous to me.
I'm going to shift us just quickly. We'll talk a little bit about two things. So we're going to cover these two, and then we'll move to Q&A. One, teacher education. How do we train teachers to do what needs to be done in the classroom, given all of the tensions around civic education? So I'm going to talk about teacher education, and then we'll talk a little bit about policy writ large? Not a simple question, but worth it. But let's start with teacher education. So what can teacher education programs do to prepare teachers for 21st century civic education?
I'll just say a couple words about that. I think there's lots of assets in the teacher force in terms of there are many, for example, especially social studies teachers in middle school and high school are just the salt of their earth and the center of their communities, and sometimes elementary school teachers too. But I think there's things to work on, and I would just name two. There is content knowledge in history and politics that particularly one of the Q&A questions asked about high school teachers who weren't really trained for that. But I would actually particularly emphasize elementary classroom teachers, because we're really asking them to so let me say also that the Educating for American Democracy framework is really asking for the most intellectually rigorous civics curriculum that has ever been offered in the United States. I don't buy the idea that back in the day we taught civics with so much rigor and now we don't. I think it was often over history quite weak. But because of the needs in the 21st century, we're asking for the most academically rigorous civics to be offered at mass scale that's ever been done, and that's going to take some investment in content knowledge. And as Paul said earlier, that's not just by any means on the education programs and education schools and education departments. I mean, it's very much on the history department and the political science department in higher ed. And by the way, it's not just the teacher who needs it, because we also would like the parents and others who have demand side pressure on the schools to have more content knowledge. So it's content knowledge. Content knowledge is my first bullet point, and the second one would be and there are a bunch of people who are listening to this call who are real experts on this today, but pre-service and in-service education for dealing with controversy in the classroom. It's really challenging. You're talking about a situation that unfolds in real time. You can't prep for when the individual student says something extremely horrible about a category of other students in the classroom, but exercising their free speech on a topic that you assigned. What are you supposed to do? And what you're supposed to do depending on the age level and the demographics and the content of the curriculum and all kinds of other things, and your relationship with the students and what's happened before and what's happened after. These are delicate issues and they can go badly quickly. And I think you can't control those situations, but you can prepare for them, and you can prepare for them with other professionals. And there's not much. I mean, again, there's always positives out there in the world, but there's not much professional development, especially in service, for dealing with controversial current events.
Thank you.
Just on the
Go ahead, Linda.
Just on the point of how do you prep for that? I think prepping for the controversial moment or the thing that happens in a moment is one kind of prep. There's another, which is how do you create a classroom community in which you continually teaching the civic virtues and civic discourse, that is part of the warp and woof in every classroom in every content area, so that people, so young children even, and I've seen this, marvelously done in elementary as well as secondary schools, learn how to talk to each other, learn how to deal with disagreements, learn how to be an empathic member of the community. Part of that is grounded in deep understanding of the learning sciences that Naila talked about earlier. And then part of it is this set of, teaching strategies that are both about the nature of the community in the classroom and then the way in which you manage discourse, civic discourse and disagreements and so on. And then when you get to that thing that might, first of all, you'll have fewer horrific events where kids are, bullying each other or, just being mean, racist, discriminatory, whatever it might be. And when you get to moments that are challenging, you have more tools in the whole class to deal with them. And I think that's, ultimately, there's a lot of evidence now that doesn't take time away from academic learning, because it actually makes the academic learning more successful when you have done the work to create that kind of environment.
I just want to note, and thank you, Linda, and everyone who's weighed in on that just from the perspective of a political scientist, I appreciate the emphasis that's been placed in this conversation on earlier grades than just high school. there was once a time in my own discipline when there was a lot more attention paid to what elementary age kids were learning about politics and civics, and then that just sort of disappeared. There's been a slight resurgence of late, and I think that is all to the good, because as we've just heard, that's what the learning sciences literature tells us we should be focusing on. And we should not be surprised that if we only introduce these important questions of what it means to deliberate and reason with people you disagree with in, the 10th grade, that students aren't very well equipped to do it, that maybe they should start earlier on. And my sense is that actually good teachers in the elementary grades are doing this. And so it's a matter of ensuring that they're supported in it, and that, maybe even.
I have a 5-year-old grandson that sort of is proof, that very young kids can argue, and they have an agenda and, and a point of view that they're trying to, to get across. All to say, that I think systemically, we've left a lot of opportunity to get at these issues sort of on the table by not appreciating, what very young children sort of bring with them, into school. And I think, unfortunately, the current model grinds it out of them the longer that they're there. That's unfortunate.
Could I jump in on the teacher preparation question as a non-expert, but a graduate of public schools, and actually also respond to something Nyla brought up earlier about the struggle of reflective patriotism for many people in the country who think that America is not such a promising place. America has crimes and errors and failings to the present day. And address it this way, that teacher, as Peter was saying, I've written this elsewhere, the EAD report writes this, that teacher preparation cannot be left only to the education schools and the teachers' colleges. Obviously, they're focal to that, but the entire culture of a university, of a college, has to support civic education and preparation for being citizens in the fullest sense of that, self-governing, engaged people with civic virtues as well as civic knowledge. So the challenge of being a teacher in elementary school, with some responsibility according to state standards or district standards for civics and social studies and history education, it is such a great challenge. And especially in the way that the Educating for American Democracy report talks about it, that you teach about disagreement as a reality, and you teach about particular disagreements, and you try to develop both the knowledge base and the civic virtues to deal with that and be productive. Such a challenge that's why you can't leave it only to a specific set of classes in teacher preparation coursework, or even to in-service work. There has to be discussion about what is as Peter mentioned, what is the role of the political science department and the history department and the philosophy department and other courses? What are the general studies requirements? I'll mention one book that came out just as we were finishing the EAD study by the president of Johns Hopkins University, of all places, right? The first research university in the country. And the title of the book is What Universities Owe Democracy. And his answer is, every college and university, large and small, public and private, owes an excellent civic education with at least a minimum of one course or two courses in fundamental civic knowledge about liberal democracy, American constitutional democracy, but also then broader ways of providing, he calls it pluralism, purposeful pluralism, providing the civic virtues of understanding that there are free people who disagree, and what are the skills and the habits and dispositions about civil disagreement, and hearing a diverse range of views and being able to respond constructively. So this is the civic crisis we are in, of our civic culture, of civic knowledge, is very serious. It's in the EAD report, I think we used, or maybe I'm just thinking we talked about it, we used the Sputnik metaphor, right? This is a real crisis. The difficulty for American culture is that the threat is our own set of failures and our negligence about civic education. The threat isn't external. In the Nation at Risk report in the 1980s, the threat was external. These nation states and economies that we rebuilt in West Germany and Japan and South Korea, well, they're suddenly kicking our butt in economic productivity. And so we have to focus on those kinds of academic subjects in the schools. The challenge is more like what Lincoln talked about in 1838, his first great speech as a nobody, but as an aspiring politician, speech in 1838 on the perpetuation of our institutions, called the Lyceum Address. This is 2 decades before Civil War erupts, but in effect, he can see it coming. There's a civic disintegration happening because to put words in his mouth, there's angry polarization happening. Right? There's violence and enormous anger and disregard of your fellow citizens. And he says the root issue is failure of civic education to include civic knowledge and civic virtues. That's the kind of moment we're in. We've got to rally all of higher education, not just put it on the teachers' colleges and education schools, or just put it on the K-12 schools and boards of education.
Yeah.
We need to rebuild the whole ecosystem. Who's sitting on the board of education? Who are the parents? If the principal has a degree in chemistry, what should their real investment be in civics and history education? So.
David, I know you want to get to the Q&A where there's a bunch of stuff there, but I just want to appreciate Paul's last point about the kind of responsibility and opportunity to get better at this doesn't rest solely, with ed schools, even though there are lots of things that ed schools can and should do. I think to Peter's point to get at it. But to the extent that the K-12 system gets its signals from higher ed, we could do with a better set of signals. That'd probably help us in lots of ways. On the policy front, it wouldn't hurt if we did have standards that looked and worked more like what is implied by EAD, and what I think Peter was suggesting. Right now, they're sort of all over the place, and probably the weights are set a little more toward knowledge and facts than what to do with those facts. But attention there would help a lot. I could say more about it, but I'm sort of interested in helping you get to the audience.
So what I'm going to do is, rather than extend our discussion of possible policy levers, I'm going to move to the Q&A. Kent has already alluded somewhat to public policy. As our panelists are responding to the questions that come through the Q&A, maybe keep in mind the policy environment, what might be done in state legislatures, or even by the federal government or the local level, wherever the right level of government is to implement effective civic ed, and what they might be doing. Again, just as a reminder, lots and lots of questions coming through the Q&A. They're actually being moderated. So hopefully we will cover as much as possible what people are posing, but we may not get to everyone, and I do apologize for that. But I'm going to start with a big question that came up earlier on, that I've sort of kept in the hopper, which is, what do we mean by a democratic crisis? Already the theme of a nation at risk from the 1980s has come up, and some people have posed in the Q&A the question of, is this just a nation at risk all over again? Is this something different? What do we mean by the crisis? And I think by clarifying that, it'll help us address, well, what are we going to do about it? So let me just ask, what is the crisis?
I've been appreciating those comments in the chat, because I think it's good to be critically questioning what the crisis language. It's a rhetorical move that we make in public life. We call things crises, and I think it's worth asking whether that's what we have. I would say we should be working on civic education, whether or not it's a crisis. Been trying to work on it for a long time. I also have been on this call and other work trying to take a kind of glasses half full and asset-based attitude towards the education part of it, because I think sometimes the crisis language ends up implying that everything's just completely terrible on the K-12 side, and that's not a good place to start. It's just not true, and it's also not nowhere to go from there. But I would say, just kind of atmospherically, I think, I mean, David is a political scientist. There are a lot of really distinguished political scientists on the call listening to us, so I better answer this well. But I do think there's just a sea change. You know, for many years, the general assumption in political science was that we had a stable political order, a stable constitutional regime. People might be very critical of it and actually upset that it's so stable because they might see built-in injustices, but people thought it was stable. And at this moment, books like How Democracies Die and The Four Threats, and these are I'm naming political science titles that are extremely influential. And I mean, there's a debate about whether we're in a crisis, and we shouldn't foreclose the debate or pretend that it's just obvious that we are. But I think it's very interesting that the concern is about the fundamental stability of the political order. Some people also thinking that it would be good if it ruptured because we could get to somewhere better. That's certainly a line you can find, but that's just a sea change, and I think it changes the way you think about civics, because it used to be. This goes back to a point made much earlier. Maybe by Naila, I can't remember who, about sort of is promoting, or maybe it was when we were prepping for this call, not on the call, but whether encouraging participation is what we need to do. And I would just describe my own perception of the field over 25 years is, back in the day, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the idea was the political system was stable. Problem was there was sort of lackluster engagement and participation, and the engagement was unequal. So we're trying to drive up engagement. And those days, the books were things like The End of History, right? The Francis Fukuyama books suggesting that it's over. We don't have the regime is totally stable globally. And now I think, you know, some of the participation looks, and it depends on your partisanship, but some of the participation looks downright bad, and the institutions look very unstable, and so that it's hard for me to avoid crisis language when I'm talking about the institutions. That the K-12 schools, I would more think of it as, and this is just speaking for myself, I would more think of it as K-12 schools have got to be part of solving the crisis that's more on the side of the institutions.
Thank you, Peter. I will note, I just can't help but interject on this point, on this issue of whether we should still care about participation. We get pretty excited in the United States when presidential election turnout is 65%. So just think about that. That's 65%. That's nowhere near 100%. And it's worth asking, what would our political system look like if we were closer to 90-95% turnout? And that's just turnout in a presidential election. That is, you know, the most frequent of all political activity, much lower levels of engagement when you talk about either other elections or other ways of getting involved. Any other thoughts on just what the crisis is?
Well, yeah, I think that there's the question of what are we doing? You know, we think of our public education system as the way in which we build a democratic sensibility, you know, the reflective patriotism and all of the other virtues that Paul talked about. But you know, we are in a moment where you mentioned participation. We have active voter suppression going on in many, many states, people being taken off the rolls, and, you know, all kinds of things going on that way. The rule of law is in question. The institutions are, you know, democratic institutions are being questioned and avoided, even by, you know, people who are supposed to be part of the governance structure. The Congress is dysfunctional. Do we lay all of that at the heels of K-12 education? I think there are other factors that have led to the crisis. To Peter's point, there may be ways in which schools can contribute to the democratic understandings that could allow people to, you know, grow up and engage in less democratic threats than we are currently experiencing. But it's, you know, it's hard to imagine that it is because of what's been taught in school. I think it's because perhaps that, you know, we haven't developed as much. There has been less attention, perhaps, to developing the sensibilities that that are not only about civic participation, but about civic reasoning, about being seeing oneself as part of the community.
And you know, David, the market for bad news is much healthier than the market for good news. I just want to get that on the table, and note that to sort of underscore Peter's point about it's not as bad as it looks. You know, we don't do as good a job of talking about you know, the good things that are going on, or more importantly, for instance, what parents and voters are for, or what they want more of. And if more of that sort of got on the table, we might almost get to a glass half full point of view about, you know, what's possible here. But you know, I'm looking at polling data that suggests that teaching critical skills such as problem solving and communication and teamwork and sort of getting along, you know, over 3/4 of parents and voters actually want that. They also want an accurate history taught in the schools. So I think if we could sort of zero in on the thing that a very large, if silent majority claim to want, we might see that there's less of a crisis and more of an opportunity if we could decide how to leverage public opinion, you know, to advance policies and actions that gonna move us forward.
Yeah, thank you. On the glass half empty, glass half full issue, I'll just make my little editorial comment that people who complain about the kids these days, in my experience, don't spend a lot of time with the kids these days. That in my interactions with young people, I actually do not come away discouraged. I actually come away quite encouraged that often they are very good at doing exactly the sorts of things that we're talking about, including disagreeing with one another.
Can I just say though, it's one I want to make sure we don't end without acknowledging one other element of the crisis, I think, is the crisis that teachers are facing in figuring out how to manage these issues in such a complex and contested political terrain. So I feel an obligation to give voice to that sense of crisis and terror and fear and anger and, you know, all of the ways the current political moment is playing out for teachers who are trying to figure out what to do that's best for kids and what to do that doesn't get them fired. So just noting.
Yes, thank you. Again, lots of questions. We'll get to as many as we possibly can, but one that came up early on that I do think is worth noting. This conversation has focused on the United States appropriately, but it is worth acknowledging that civic education spans beyond the United States. And so I thought I might ask the panelists to reflect a little bit on what themes from our conversation might apply more broadly and not only to an American context.
Well, clearly there's been a lot of discourse about the rise of authoritarianism and fascism around the world. And so in these times of great uncertainty, and the human race is hurtling towards an unknown future here, which is creating a variety of other crises, which I think may feed into this crisis, climate crises and political crises and famine, and there's all conflicts of various kinds. And I think that may feed the tendency in many, regimes to towards authoritarianism and away from democracy. So I certainly think that we are not alone in this moment in the world.
I feel like I'm just plain the grizzled veteran of civics today. That's my role. So I remember a kind of sea change, which was in the late 90s, early 2000s. We were still in the era of lots of American experts on civics going out to the world to tell people how to do it. And I really think that era is not there. There are wonderful programs that involve Americans overseas, but the era of telling people that you should do civics like we do in American schools is kind of over. And what's much more interesting is figuring out what's being invented. I mean, just as two quick examples. I know about Ukrainian colleagues who were doing really interesting research around, not research, they were doing really good curricula around combating Russian-generated online propaganda before we got focused on that. And I would recommend learning from that. And then just another example is participatory budgeting for young people is quite common now as a experience where your young people are involved in actually allocating funds. I think some of that in your community, Paul, in Phoenix. But that comes from Brazil. That's a Brazilian import. So I think we need to be in a period where we're looking for where a lot of the challenges are, whether it's propaganda or authoritarianism or polarization, are widely shared. Not universal. No polarization in Denmark, but they sure have it in a bunch of countries, and where we can actually learn from good practices in other countries.
Thank you. Obviously, a lot more we could say about the global reach of civic education, but let's move on and talk about a theme that, while we discuss it a lot in the US, does apply elsewhere, and that is polarization. We've had lots of questions about polarization, but let me just maybe give a capsule summary. We have a lot of research that shows when people are faced with ideological opposition, rather than move to the middle or reason with their opponent, they often just double down on their own views. So, like, one challenge of having discussions in a classroom setting is you could actually exacerbate polarization rather than minimize it. So the question is, what kind of classroom practices can counter that hunkering down, pulling apart tendency, so that if we do have these conversations in classrooms, it really does serve the purpose of teaching the sort of civic friendship that has been already mentioned.
We've been talking about the pedagogies that teachers might need to learn, and one of them is this way of developing disciplined understanding and listening and thinking and so on. Socratic seminars are one of the ways that, one of the tools that teachers can use. There are lots of other ways by which students can learn to have to at least listen and take into account and perhaps pursue further evidence about the places where there can be disagreements. I gave the example of the assessment in Washington State, where students are asked to consider both points of view and two principles that are in tension, and then reason through and acknowledge the other point of view as they come to their own judgment. That mode of thinking, that way of analyzing and evaluating and thinking through and having to respond, and then doing that in the classroom, can be taught, and it has to be part of the kind of warp and woof of the way in which we're teaching and learning. And one of the things that we haven't mentioned, but I think it has been a challenge, is that early in the 2000s, the No Child Left Behind Act called for annual testing with high stakes attached to it. And many states beyond the reading and math tests required were also then testing in other subject areas in ways that in the United States are almost entirely multiple choice. Whereas in other countries, the reasoned essay, the disciplined discourse is actually part of the assessment system as well. So schools really felt like they had to get the facts in a way that kids can find the one right answer out of 5, and a right answer way of thinking, which is very different mode of thinking. It's not that you can't have both, but you have to make room for a mode of thinking in which you're weighing and balancing and considering and evaluating and so on. And that really did. There's a lot of evidence that mode of thinking was de-emphasized during that era of public policy. And so I think we have to think about how do you both build the curriculum systems and the assessment systems and the pedagogical systems in which the mode of thinking and weighing and balancing, listening, thinking, evaluating evidence, and considering alternative points of view is part of the warp and woof of learning.
Thank you.
So,
Go ahead,
I
Ken.
think, I think Linda just described the 2 or 3 rather obvious policy levers that could be pulled more or less in concert to deal with. I just want to add a small point. It wouldn't hurt if we introduced a little more data into the system about what the kids actually want to do. And I think we'd be stunned. I think it was your point, David, about, you're actually hopeful when you get in front of young people. I think you'd be stunned, the correspondence between the kinds of things kids actually want to work on and the kind of schools you'd need to organize and pedagogical practices you would employ to kind of leverage, their own motivations and interests.
Thank you.
And by the way, they love to discuss things and argue, and you can teach them to argue productively and with attention to each other's perspectives.
Well, with the mention of focusing on students, let me pose a very important question that's come up in various iterations. What do we do about connecting with students who feel marginalized or disaffected? Who decides what civic education is? There's a lot of concern about a colonial narrative, or presenting a vision of America that maybe doesn't feel inclusive to everyone. This, of course, is a huge issue in civic education, and it's not one that we should ignore. So let me just ask the panel, how do we do that? How do we make sure that disaffected, marginalized communities feel fully a part of civic education?
I'll get us kicked off and would welcome other perspectives. I would argue 2 things. One is accurate history is really critically important. And I think sometimes we're in the midst of major controversy about this right now nationally. And I think it's really important that we have a shared sense of the actual and accurate history of our country and of the journey of many different groups in that history. And then second, I think it comes back to something we've been talking about all along, which is civic issues play out in everyone's communities. And so how do you have curriculum that really roots in what are the ways civic issues are playing out locally, and creating opportunities for young people to really engage and be thoughtful and be critically thoughtful about what those issues are that are playing out locally as well as nationally. But I think that both accurate history and really creating space to take up issues as they play out in ways that are relevant to young people's lives.
And I love those too. And I want to just add one more, which is that in the school itself, all students should be equal members of the community. That there's a lot of ways in which schools can further marginalize and minoritize and create the experience of discrimination that we're so afraid to teach about these days in the states that are taking up anti-CRT legislation and so on. So the experience that's in school itself is how people experience being citizens, and we need to be sure that every student is experiencing full citizenship and recognition and support for their learning, which is not a simple thing in a lot of school contexts.
In the Educating for American Democracy report, we tried to address what Naila and Linda have just addressed, that the phrase, the Latin phrase I used earlier, sort of the motto of the United States, e pluribus unum, has a new meaning in the 20th century and the 21st century, with the vastly more diverse range of immigrants we've had in the past centuries and the range of communities. And then we just have finished Martin Luther King Day, the I think extraordinary effort in the 1960s to come to a new constitutional settlement about civil rights and equality and equality of opportunity and participation for all Americans. So the challenge of e pluribus unum is at the center of the EAD set of curricular guidelines. Again, this is an effort for states, local education authorities to take up on their own, and they would address, you know, the 50 plus states and territories, and thousands of local education authorities would address that in different ways, all the way down to the school level. But to, as Naila said, to teach accurate histories, but again, with this, the whole set of balances that the EAD is trying to achieve, it's difficult to get students interested in civic education and American history education if they think America is fundamentally a bad idea. So the report takes the view that we were patriotic about America in that reflective, critical, argumentative way of being patriotic.
Just make a quick argument for, or at least a placeholder argument for, some decentralization and public, and actually public consideration of these issues. You know, there's a tendency to think it's a scandal if different states and different communities are doing civics differently. There was a New York Times piece about a year ago. It apparently proposes a kind of expose that the McGraw-Hill textbook is different in Texas and in California. But I think we're a federal republic. The textbook quite likely should be different in Texas and California. And also, if you have people involved in this debate, they're going to land in different places given the different partisanship of the states. And it's actually better for there to be a diverse set of curricula, not just at the state level, but even more locally and even in the classroom. So some decentralization, and then you know, the current debate is ugly in many ways, and that's what my piece for the volume is about. And you could spend a long time talking about why it's bad. But I also see a sort of silver lining. I think it's appropriate that people are debating what we teach our children about our country. And the alternative that's been more typical is that nobody pays attention to that at all, except for certain specialists. So the state convenes the committee to write the standards, and the textbook company hires people like me to help them write the textbook. And it's all kind of not intentionally secretive, but it's very, very low profile, and it's not very democratic. So I think what we're seeing at the moment is ugly, but it's also appropriate that we should be debating what our various communities are teaching our children about America and about the communities.
But I think we have to recognize the rub that if, you know, there may be decentralization and different, you know, views, but if what's being taught in Texas is not accurate history, if, you know, slavery is viewed as an individual freedom, you know, that we, you know, should be honoring even today. You know, we do have some fundamental questions about equality in this country that are being litigated, if you will, and actualized in these debates that we have to recognize in the quest for a more perfect union. You know, it's not, everything is not everything.
No, I agree. And just to reinforce that, I mean, if the Florida African American history standards, they seem to be my business. I don't live in Florida, but I don't like those standards. I thought about them. I read them carefully. I read various critiques. I read defenses of them. I'm against them, and I think that's my business as somebody who cares about the United States, the Republic. So it's not a matter of just completely delegating everything to localities. Although I do think that was a particularly problematic.
The question example. About is there a common back to the sort of civic virtues? They rely on some common understanding about principles of equality. And I think when those are shaken, as we see them increasingly, again, it's not that they've never, you know, been settled, but that I think that then, you know, raises the question that how do you have the civic engagement, the civic discourse, the necessary repair functions in a society where you see the fraying of those core principles that would enable the democracy to move forward.
Now, to pick up on a theme mentioned earlier, Kent mentioned, you know, there are some polling survey results which suggest not all the news is bad. I guess, you know, Peter just mentioning it's a good thing we have controversy about attention to civics education. This is the silver lining in the crisis. And as Kent mentioned, there is evidence that there is a broad middle, so to speak. That's what we tried to represent in the EAD report of parents and other adults who think we should teach accurate histories, but we can also be patriotic about America, just to have that point. But this is very hard work, and while there is some good news, there really is a crisis. Just to take two pieces of evidence, Naila was talking earlier about the difficulty of being a teacher, the stress of being a K-12 social studies civics teacher, and even elementary school teachers who think that civics, social studies, history education is important. At my, just an anecdotal piece of evidence, at my university, Arizona State University, the largest university in the country, which has sustained student enrollments by having a very large online capacity, online degrees, enrollment in the Teachers College is down. And you can understand why.
Yeah.
For a whole range of reasons. But another very troubling set of indicators, the United States military has had enormous difficulty the past several years in recruiting enough young people to serve in the armed forces. And the polling on civic attachment, as the social scientists would call it, right? Do you think America is a good idea? Are you patriotic? Do you think it's worthwhile to live in a democracy? If you look at the numbers in the various polling results for people under the age of 30, it's underwater. America is underwater. So are there, a question, are there enough people in the adult community across a whole range of professions involved in this debate? Are enough people who respond to crisis with turning toward compromise in some way, listening to each other, hearing each other out, making some difficult compromises? Or is the response to crisis to double down on your own side and in a way continue to fuel the polarization and the anger?
Yeah, and that all seems right to me, Paul. And it's a problem that sits above this conversation about what the schools should be doing. I mean, I do think that at the same time that we wrap our minds around some obvious ways the schools could get better at this, I think you aptly describe a world in which, I actually think bad actors are sowing mistrust in democratic institutions, broadly speaking. And unfortunately, just to connect the dots, they've decided that the public schools are easy prey in which to do this for reasons, I fear, that have little or nothing to do with the schools themselves, but leave these chilling effects to which Naila spoke, for us to deal with. So I wish it weren't so. The glass half full guy in me sort of comes back and lands on the fact that most reasonable people don't want the world to look like that. And so we really need to figure out how to wake them up and I think help them, sort of engage in, I think, these very serious issues to which you refer.
Well, folks, thank you very much for all those thoughts. I truly wish we could get to all of the questions. There were a few mentioned that we won't have time to discuss, but I nonetheless will flag here because I want us to walk away thinking about them. And one of them is, frankly, a kind of a juicy topic for this panel, which is the role of private foundations and philanthropy in civic education. What does it mean when we have a larger role for private philanthropy? Does that mean that the state is receding? And what does that say about our civic life? I think that's a big question. it's worth thinking even more than we have here about marginalized communities and how they can be fully incorporated into civic education. And, you know, we've had a little bit of disagreement here, and it's worth wrestling with the idea of how much of civic education across at least the United States should be common, and how much variation would we expect to see across communities and states. And I think that is a tough question, and one that we've seen a little bit of disagreement here on, and one worth thinking about. But as I said, our time is up, and so we won't be able to cover all of those themes. But let me just wrap things up by once again reminding everyone that many of the themes that we've discussed here, and even more, are contained in the issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, titled Education, there it is, in a time of civic education in a time of democratic crisis. It is free to the world for roughly the next month or so. We encourage you all to check it out. And again, don't just download it for the sake of downloading it, but read it, engage with it, please. Use it as we want it to be a force multiplier in the world of civic education. So hopefully there'll be further conversations about it. Let me also take a moment and thank all of our panelists. I am grateful for their time across many time zones that they have taken their time to participate with us. And let me thank all of you who joined us on the webinar. We had a fantastic response to this, which I think is an indication that civic education, it's important. People care about it. And so I hope that we can continue to have these conversations, and hopefully we can build a better civic education for everyone. So with that, we will sign off, but thank you all. Bye-bye.